do want to invite Omer again to the stage to talk about how to make the most out of your penetration test. Guys, very interesting lecture. Omer, it's your stage.
All right, thanks. All right, so making the most out of your pen test. Great. All right, great. So the agenda for today is, again, we'll just, in a general sense, I'll quickly cover what we did in GRSee, and then we go into the actual content, which is the tip and notes on how to gain more from your standard penetration test project or service. So, like I said before in the previous lecture, who am I? I'm Omer Donil, CTO in GRSee. Previously pen tester and consultant, solve compliance and design flaws by the day. I like short introductions, so I'm going to skip that. All right, so we already covered the GRSee parts in the previous lecture, so I'm going to skip that as well. All right, so from years of doing kickoffs and summary meetings for penetration test projects, I've accumulated some tips that could allow you to better utilize the Pentest project and the service provided with it. So this is my list of items I mostly see forgotten or overlooked that you could use during this interaction. All right, so it's by the way, there's no like order for this. It's just general tips all over the place. All right, so vulnerability score versus risk score. Okay, let me show you a quick story about something that happened a couple of years ago. A company has ordered two penetration tests for two services. One service was the main customer service portal, and the other one was a time reporting portal that all employees were using about once a month to submit their timetables. It so happened that the company used the same baseline image for both services, and the image had known vulnerability in it. So we have two services with the same vulnerability, but one service is more important than the other. Now, both vulnerability got the same critical score, got the same score, which is critical, of course, because the web service was part of the image, and that web service allowed remote code execution by anonymous access. But the vulnerability on the external customer portal is much scarier than the business, it's much scarier to the business than the vulnerability on the internal time reporting service. So how do the information security manager can justify prioritizing one over the other? Because on paper, both vulnerabilities got the same score. So what you need to take into account here is that when a pen tester scores a vulnerability, he often ignores the service importance to the business unless the impact is obvious. So the scoring of a vulnerability is very objective. This could make a scenario where two services, one is critical and to the organization, the other is negligible, with the same vulnerability would get the same score, but one of them has greater risk to the organization. And the key factor here is risk. This is where we need to differentiate the internal risk management and the value of the vulnerability scoring. You don't want to mix these two, because the external penetration test is not aware, the external penetration tester is not aware of your internal security controls that might affect the chances of a vulnerability being exploited. In other words, the vulnerability score is in no way related to the residual risk, meaning the actual chances of something going bad. So what do? We differentiate. Your risk management policy should allow you to be able to define an internal or practical risk score. Now, and this should take into account the vulnerability score presented by the pen tester, but allow you to assign a rationalized scoring based on the asset importance. It is a way of saying we accept the vulnerability on its own, it's high, but on this server, which has no impact on our business, we define the internal risk as medium, or the other way around. A low vulnerability on a critical server would make the internal risk score as high. This could go on with any variance of of security controls that could also impact and influence a vulnerability on a certain server. For example, internal server has a certain set of security controls guarding it, and external server might have less or might have more. So this is something that should allow you to fine-tune the difference between a vulnerability score and a risk score of the asset. Right, so, and that leads us to the next item, which is the vulnerability score. It can be discussed, right? It's not something that is written in stone. We can talk about it. There are several methods to score vulnerabilities, and these are all tools that meant to quantify something that is a security gap. So most of these methods, what they simply do is they divide the vulnerability into certain aspects, and that makes it easier to quantify the value, right, of a security gap. So this means that if you disagree with the scoring, you just need to point out which values are miscalculated. Now, in most cases, customers might not know how to approach the scoring methodology, but they still disagree with the general scoring. We, of course, help offer with putting this opinion into calculator and see how it reflects. But you got to remember that the final decision is reserved for the one who's signing the report. Okay, so that in most cases, that is the pen tester. With that said, we still need to remember that the vulnerability score does not reflect the internal risk score. So claiming something like there is no damage to the company if the service is abused makes no sense, because you cannot say that, you can say that on all the vulnerabilities that will be found on an asset, but if the asset has no impact on the business, that raises the question of why did you even bother running a pen test on it at all? Yeah, so that is the main concept from changing a vulnerability score. You can do it, it's negotiable. You got to remember that the final say belongs to the pen tester, because he's the one signing the report. It's his report, not yours. All right, great. So now let's start with a quick run on the difference between the setups for a pen test. So we have three types of pen test setups: black box, white box, and gray box. The difference is that black box, the pen testers knows nothing except for scope, right? It's something like do everything you can, but don't go outside this URL. Okay, so it's very limiting. What it does is basically it simulates an attacker that happened to focus on that service with no prior knowledge, which is, by the way, rarely the case, because an attacker decides what to focus on in most cases because he has some leverage over the service. He found some way of getting the first foothold, or has some internal knowledge on the processes that go there. So, so that's black box for you. Gray box, the pen tester knows some stuff, right? Like credentials to your user account, or how to use a service, or some internal data that is publicly available, like API documentation. Now, this simulates an employee or a customer that are going bad. White box means that the pen tester gets full access to everything, to all relevant data and permissions, so he can be very thorough with his tests. So what are the security values of each one and which one to pick? Let's start with black, right, sorry. All right, let's start with a black box. This type of testing is very flat and tests a very specific way of thinking, of attacking a service. If you are looking to check a box with the pen test, this one is the way to go, as it will give you the least amount of headache, probably less finding, and require almost no preparation from your team. So, and just to note here, don't confuse black box with red team exercises, as they have different goals, right? Black box, you limit the pen tester to a specific URL or domain or whatever, and red team, you basically go, I'm not telling you anything, go wild, do whatever you can, but show me the weakest point that I have in my services. Right, so these are, so this is black box. Right, next, white box. White box, when you provide the tester with lots of knowledge and permissions, right, so you make the test very thorough, but accordingly, it often takes a lot longer because you have much more surface to cover. It also means that some of the results are based on the knowledge taught to the pen tester, which is not something a standard attacker would have. So if you are looking for a very, very thorough examination, white box is the way to go. Gray box is the compromise, right? The best of two worlds is the right solution in most cases, as it will provide you a solid review of the system where the pen tester simulates anonymous access and user access and registered user attacks, and he will need also to spend some time on information gathering. So you kind of get the best of everything. So in my honest opinion, gray box is the standard, the most obvious and easiest solutions. But again, each aspect has its own benefits, so choose accordingly. Right, so the next one is focusing the pen tester. You know your business better than the pen tester. During the kickoff meeting, it is common to ask if you have specific pointers that you want the pen tester to focus on. In most cases, these are fairly obvious. For example, in a multi-tenant service, you probably want to test for a cross-account data leakage, but this is an educated guess. So if you have items that you definitely want to see in the pen test, it would be wise for you to show it just to make sure that it is right there, it is noted, and not taken for granted. Also worth sharing is the vulnerabilities you already know of. You don't want the pen tester to waste time on investigating and reporting something that you already know that the system has. It's like reading the same newspaper twice, right? Nothing new will come out of it, and it's wasting valuable time. So on the other hand, basically it's the same note. If you want a retest of all the results, you can show the previous report, and we will be obviously able to verify it during the project. Right, with or without WAF. WAF can be a game changer. A good implementation can block most of the attacks, but are you testing the WAF or the application or the current setup? Testing with WAF will show you results that are more practical to a real-life scenario, but it will not allow you to, sorry. It will not allow you to test the application directly. Now, this makes the scenario that if a WAF bypass technique is found, then your application has lost the one and only security control you're relying on, and that is way too many eggs for one basket. Now, this is why I recommend considering WAF as an add-on security rather than the main security control. It is good to have, but it is external to the application. So in my opinion, application penetration test should run without a WAF, but use it according to your needs, so as it is very dependent on the scenario that you are testing and the result you are looking to find. For example, if you are looking to find how robust is your service in a general sense, in its own state, in production, then you do want to test it with all relevant security controls that you have in place. And if you just want to test the code, then you might want to skip the WAF and test directly the application itself. Awareness training, right. So awareness training is where we test employees' awareness. And to test employee awareness, you need two main things. First of all, you need them interacted with a suspicious character. Second of all, you need signs in that interaction that should be identified by them, since this is what you are evaluating, right? An employee who is aware to his environment should be aware to notify, to identify certain hints or certain clues within the interaction that are clearly a flag raiser. That indicates that the interaction is something malicious is going on there. So how do you test awareness? You artificially embed signs into the interaction, either via phone or email or face-to-face. You need there to be signs as this is what you're testing. So you make sure that the email address is intentionally misspelled, right? The formality is mixed. The context of the email is unclear. If you provide the testing team with too much information, then they will use it to create something that is too familiar to an original internal interaction. And this won't testify for much, as the conclusion here will be that the employee is basically doing his job, right? Because there will not be enough signs to test his awareness. Okay, if you receive an email from the right person, the right time, with the right context, so then the phishing was very successful, but actually, if you're doing an awareness test, you haven't really tested the employee awareness. On the other hand, if you choose not to share data, right, which is also an option to that you be sure to consider, right, the fact that the team will need either to send the template phishing, something like here is your receipt for your last purchase, which is relevant for most people, or to do some intelligence gathering that might hold some guesstimation when creating the background story. And that might also fail, but it will also reflect to you in some degree what is your internet footprint regarding if an attacker decides to make up a story and go on to attack your environment. But which, by the way, it's kind of a different project, so you don't want to mix your goals into this, right? You focus on one thing and test it directly. On a side note, in email-based phishing exercises, unless you're testing the mail filtering system, you should whitelist the domain used for phishing. Otherwise, there is a good chance that the mail filtering will do its job and filter out the exercises. All right, we're kind of running out of time, so I'm gonna keep up the pace. Pen tester versus scanners, right? So it's a common question. Customers often ask me, what is the difference between the output of a vulnerability scanner and the pen tester? So, like, don't they do the same thing? I'll keep it short. A scanner is automated, quick to cover, and not deep. It is good for when you got a wide area to cover and not afraid of false positive. Scanner does not test for logical malfunctions. So that means that if you have a web server or web interface that says, put operating system commands in the parameter and mark them with the $sign, a scanner would not understand the vulnerability in it. A pen tester, on the other hand, is human, and he got the logic part, but he is single-threaded, so the testing is much slower but deeper. On the other hand, pen tester can run a scanner, but not vice versa. So vulnerability scanner fit better for automated procedures. Pen testers are for critical stages like onboarding, or moving into production, or business process implementation, etc. From reporting perspective, pen testers' reports are more focused on to practical impact with less chances to false positives. And let me give you an example, just to be clear. Let's say let's say you have an unpatched service in your environment with known vulnerability. Vulnerability scanner will identify the version and report of the finding as is. I'm talking generally, not specifically. Like I know that some scanners would try and go on to do the full exploitation. Pentester will try to exploit, and if it succeeded, it will be detailed in the report. But if it didn't manage to run the attack, for example, like the vulnerable code is not in use, or the current configuration is hardened with a set of permission or whatever, anything that blocks the attack from running. Now, if it didn't manage to run the attack, there will be an informative section to the report explaining that it was found, but without actual damage. All right, so these are the main differences that you would get within a pen tester versus a scanner. Now, testing on production or staging. Although most pen testers know how to avoid damage on production environment, we must remember that the pen tester did not create the service, so they cannot predict how it will process different variables. So from that perspective, testing on staging has clear advantage as it poses less risk on customers. On the other hand, production testing will give you results that are practical to your needs. It is very straightforward here. It's like, here is the server, here is the bug. Staging is a bit different since there is not necessarily the same version of production, or there is sometimes changes because like someone updated something and they uploaded a new build. So, and sometimes you might have security features that are relevant to production, but are not enabled on staging. And that report, and all of that is basically accumulate to the fact that the report you get from a pen test, from the pen test will reflect that the security posture of staging and not the production environment, right? So hopefully it's similar, but if there are differences, it's something that you need to take into account and and be able to differentiate the results. All right, so using a pen tester. For each project, you can ask a sit down and review the report and query about what and how the scope was tested. It is better to read the report ahead of time. This way you have a question on how to fix a vulnerability. You could skip the general overview of the report and focus on what's the matter. Although the pen testers are not in an integration position, you could and should reflect the plan that you have for remediation and see if that would leave security gaps in place. It is more often than not that the pen tester already have a perfect solution for your situation, but he is not aware of the limitations that you have in place. So the topic is not even raised. All right, I'm going to skip a couple of notes here just to make sure that we stay in line. So there could be more than one meeting to follow up on a remediation vulnerability. And one of the notes that you want to remember that even if a pen tester does not have the right solution for you, he is not working alone. There is a complete company standing behind him, and he could probably put you in touch with the right person to provide you the answer that you're looking for. So yeah, so that as well. Right, so how to choose a pen test company? Well, first of all, and I'm not being objective here, choose us. But for real, you can learn a lot about the company and quality of the test just from the first interaction and how they evaluate the application before they submitted their offer. For example, did they see the application, or did they ask for anything regarding your needs for the project? For example, running a pen test for PCI or running a pen test for SOX is two different things. Does it feel like the salesperson know what he's selling to you? You could easily end up with an unwanted project or less value than what you paid for if the terms of the project were set by a person who doesn't understand your needs. Another item to query on is who is responsible within the company to ensure the pen test quality is sufficient. Another point to ask is how much of the pen tester is relying on automated scanners. Is it a scanner that runs over the application and someone just deletes false positive, or how much manual work is applied to the project? Evaluating a pen test project during the project is pretty hard because you can't overview the whole process. But in a general sense, you can sample the pen tester for relevant input, like is there enough time? What do you think of the system so far, etc. The best answer to value a project, if a project was done, is reading the report. Was done properly, right? Is reading the report and seeing if you can answer the questions of how secure is the system. Right? It's like a final note on what do you know about your system after the pen test is done, and does the report reflect that? Right, the last note in this for this session is a report that has no finding. Right now, as we all know, everything has a risk to it in some degree. So the moment we install an asset, we hold the risk of the asset being compromised. But penetration testing, opposed to risk assessment, is all about finding vulnerabilities and not assessing the risk. So it is very rare, but in some circumstances, it might occur that a pen test has no findings, and when that happens, you want to see a detailed answers that explain why the application is secure on all fronts and how it was tested. Now, this would allow you to understand the security posture of the application or identify if there is any kind of false negative assumptions in the report. All in all, it's very rare, and I haven't seen such report in years. So yeah, so that's that. All right, I rushed it, but I think I made it in time. If you have any questions, let me know.